It was an ordinary Wednesday morning when I received the news that shattered my world. My mother, my rock, and the one person who understood me completely had passed away unexpectedly. The grief hit me like a tidal wave, and I found myself navigating through a fog of sorrow and disbelief. As I sat on the edge of my bed, the reality of her absence sank in, but little did I know, this tragedy was just the beginning of a more complicated chapter in my life. In the days that followed, the house was filled with condolences, but none of it felt real. Friends and family came by to share their sympathies, but I felt like I was floating above it all, watching as life moved on without me. My husband, Mark, tried to comfort me, but he was struggling too. He had always been supportive, yet the weight of the situation made it difficult for us to connect. Our conversations became strained, often reduced to brief exchanges about logistics rather than emotional support. Then, one afternoon, I received an unexpected phone call from my mother-in-law, Evelyn. She had been living alone since my father-in-law passed away several years earlier, and she wanted to come over to talk. I braced myself for the visit, knowing that our relationship had been rocky at best. I welcomed her into our home, but her presence filled the space with tension. She often reminded me of how I could never measure up to the expectations she had for a daughter-in-law. As we sat in the living room, Evelyn's expression was unreadable. She began by expressing her condolences, but her voice quickly turned serious. "I've been thinking," she said, her gaze fixed on me. "With your mother gone, I don't want you to feel alone. I think it's best if I move in with you for a while. You need support, and I can help with the household." My heart sank. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The last thing I needed was more pressure and tension in my home. But I also felt guilty for even considering denying her request. "I appreciate your offer, but I don't think that's a good idea," I replied cautiously. Evelyn's eyes narrowed slightly, and I could sense her disappointment. But I stood firm, determined to protect my home and my sanity. However, as the days went on, the thought of Evelyn living with us became more complicated. Mark and I had always discussed the importance of family and supporting one another. But would this be support or simply a source of conflict? The idea of having my mother-in-law under our roof filled me with dread, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that it might somehow bring us all closer together during this difficult time. Just when I thought the situation couldn't get any worse, Mark brought up the topic again. He casually mentioned how it could be beneficial for everyone, how it could help him support me better while easing his mother's loneliness. I felt a mix of anger and sadness bubble up inside me. How could he suggest this? I needed time to grieve and process my loss, not to welcome another source of tension into our home. "Mark, I really don't think it's a good idea," I insisted, my voice shaking with emotion. "I need to find my footing first. Adding your mother to the mix will only complicate things." He frowned, clearly torn between his loyalty to me and his desire to support his mother. I could see the conflict in his eyes, but my heart raced with anxiety as I realized that I had just begun my grieving process, and now I had to fight to maintain my space. That night, I lay in bed, my mind racing. I felt trapped between my grief and my growing resentment towards Evelyn's suggestion. What would it mean for our family dynamics? Would Mark and I be able to cope with the added stress? I tossed and turned, unable to find solace in sleep as my thoughts spiraled into a dark abyss. The following days were a blur of tension and uncertainty. I found myself dreading every phone call, every knock on the door, fearing it might be Evelyn suggesting her move again. Meanwhile, Mark tried to reassure me that he would set boundaries, that it wouldn't be as invasive as I feared. But the thought of sharing my home with someone who often criticized me felt suffocating. I was slowly losing the battle against my own emotions. One afternoon, as I was tidying up the living room, I stumbled upon an old photo of my mother. Her smile was warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the icy feelings I had towards Evelyn. I picked it up and traced the outline of her face, tears spilling down my cheeks as I felt the familiar ache of loss. I missed her terribly. My mother always knew how to comfort me and would have guided me through this chaos. Suddenly, the doorbell rang, pulling me out of my reverie. I opened the door to find Evelyn standing there, her expression resolute. "I need to talk to you," she declared, pushing past me into the living room without waiting for an invitation. My heart raced with dread as I closed the door behind her, knowing this conversation was inevitable. "I've thought about it, and I'm going to move in," she announced, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. I felt a surge of frustration. "Evelyn, please. I need time to grieve. You can't just impose your plans on me," I shot back, my voice laced with desperation. But she was unyielding. "I'm your family too, and I won't leave you to fend for yourself. You need support." Her words felt like a betrayal. How could she not see that her presence was overwhelming me? I tried to explain my feelings, but she dismissed them, insisting that I was just being emotional. In that moment, I realized we were at an impasse. After she left, I collapsed onto the couch, overwhelmed with frustration. Mark returned home shortly after and could see that I was upset. "What happened?" he asked, concern etched on his face. I recounted the confrontation, my voice trembling with anger and sadness. "She doesn't understand. I need my space to heal, not to have her controlling my life." Mark listened, but I could see the conflict in his eyes. "She just wants to help," he said gently. "You're going through a lot, and she wants to be there for you." But his words only fueled my anger. How could he side with her? I felt alone, trapped between my grief and the family I was suddenly supposed to support. The next few days were tense. I avoided Evelyn, trying to find solace in my own grief. But she persisted, calling often, asking when she could come by to help. I felt suffocated. Mark tried to mediate, suggesting we all sit down together to discuss things, but the thought of being in the same room with her made my stomach turn. I couldn't bear the thought of having a discussion that would only end in more conflict. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, Mark approached me with a serious expression. "I think we need to talk about this," he said, his tone heavy. "I understand you're hurting, but pushing her away might make things worse. I want to support you, but I also need to support her." His words cut deep, and I felt my heart sink. Why couldn't he see that I was already struggling? "I can't just open our home to her," I exclaimed, my voice rising with emotion. "I'm not ready for that. I need time to process my grief without her hovering over me." My frustration boiled over, and tears streamed down my face. I felt so alone in this battle, as if my emotions were being dismissed. Mark stepped back, his face softening as he tried to understand my pain. "I'm here for you, but we can't ignore her feelings either. She lost her son's wife, and she's grieving too." His words struck me like a blow. I hadn't considered Evelyn's perspective, only my own hurt and anger. But did that mean I had to accept her living with us? As the days turned into weeks, the tension grew. Evelyn continued to reach out, suggesting we all get together for dinner. I felt cornered, and my anxiety escalated. Finally, I agreed, thinking that perhaps confronting the situation would help. But deep down, I feared it would only explode into more chaos. When the day arrived, I prepared the house, trying to create a calm atmosphere. But as soon as Evelyn walked in, I felt the air grow heavy with unspoken tension. We sat around the table, and the awkward silence was palpable. Mark attempted to fill the void with small talk, but it felt forced and strained. "Thank you for inviting me," Evelyn said finally, her voice too cheery for the situation. "I know we've had our differences, but I really do care about you." I forced a smile, feeling my heart race. Did she really mean it, or was this another attempt to impose her will? As the dinner progressed, I felt myself slipping into a state of discomfort. Evelyn made comments about the house and how I could improve things, her tone dripping with condescension. I clenched my jaw, feeling anger bubble beneath the surface. Mark shifted uncomfortably, clearly sensing my agitation. I was about to explode. Finally, I snapped. "You're not my mother, Evelyn. I don't need you telling me how to run my home." The words spilled out before I could stop them, and the room fell silent. Mark's eyes widened in shock, and I felt the heat rush to my cheeks. Evelyn's expression hardened, and for a moment I thought she might cry. But instead, she stood up, her face a mask of anger. "I was only trying to help. You have no idea what I'm going through. I lost my son's wife." Her voice trembled with emotion, and I felt a pang of guilt stab through me. She was grieving too, but her approach was suffocating. The tension in the room was unbearable as we glared at each other. Mark stood between us, trying to mediate, but I could see he was struggling to find the right words. "We need to calm down," he said finally, his voice steady but filled with concern. "Let's take a break and talk this through." I stormed out of the room, my heart racing with frustration. I felt trapped between two worlds, my grief and my desire for space, and the reality of Evelyn's persistence. I paced the kitchen, my mind racing as I tried to process what had just happened. Did I cross a line? Moments later, Mark joined me. "I know this is hard for you," he said quietly, "but we have to find a way to talk about this without it escalating." I looked up at him, my heart heavy. "How can we do that when she doesn't respect my boundaries?" Mark took a deep breath, clearly trying to find the right words. "Maybe it's time we set some ground rules. It's your home, and you deserve to feel safe here. But we also have to show Evelyn some compassion. It's a difficult time for all of us." His words resonated with me, but I still felt the weight of resentment towards his mother. We returned to the dining room, where Evelyn sat with her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. The air was thick with unresolved tension, and I knew we had to address the elephant in the room. "Evelyn," I began, my voice trembling but steady. "I appreciate that you want to help, but I need you to respect my space while I grieve. I'm not ready for you to move in." Evelyn's expression softened slightly, but I could tell she was still hurt. "I just wanted to be there for you," she replied quietly. "I'm sorry if I overstepped, but I'm also hurting." Her words hit me hard, and I realized that in my anger, I had overlooked her pain. The conversation took a turn, and we began to share our feelings openly. I expressed my grief and the overwhelming pressure I felt, while Evelyn shared her feelings of loneliness and loss. For the first time, I saw her not just as my mother-in-law, but as a woman grieving the loss of her son's wife. By the end of the night, the atmosphere had shifted. We may not have resolved everything, but we had taken a step toward understanding each other. As we said our goodbyes, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Maybe this was a new beginning for all of us, a chance to support each other in our grief, rather than letting it tear us apart. In the following weeks, things gradually improved. Evelyn didn't push the idea of moving in anymore, but she did offer her help more thoughtfully. Mark and I began to communicate better about our feelings, and slowly I felt my grief start to ease. It wasn't perfect, but we were finding our way. I realized that family is complicated, especially in times of loss, but through our struggles, we were learning to navigate the murky waters of grief together. In the end, it wasn't just about loss. It was about connection, understanding, and the strength we found in one another. And while I still missed my mother every single day, I learned that love and support can come from unexpected places, even from those we thought we couldn't tolerate. Life is unpredictable, and sometimes it takes a little chaos to find clarity. As I reflect on those weeks, I know now that we'll always carry our grief with us. But as we move forward, we do so with a renewed sense of purpose, ready to face whatever life throws our way. And perhaps, in our journey together, we can find solace in knowing we are not alone.